for the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Our mission is to provide leadership in preventing and responding to sexual violence through collaborating, sharing and creating resources, and promoting research. And I mainly do work training and technical assistance for the RPE, the Rape Prevention and Education Program. And if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. So that's me. I'm up there in the corner. I live in Tacoma, Washington. This is located on the land of the Puyallup Nation, which the reservation is quite near us, but this is land that until there was a treaty, used to belong to the Puyallup folks. I am a white person. I'm temporarily able-bodied. I'm property owning. I'm queer. I'm non-binary. I prefer they and them pronouns. She and her are fine too. I like to share that bit about myself because there are areas where we all have areas of privilege and where we all might have areas where we are not privileged. So it's just a nice thing to be thinking about when you are going into working in other communities and letting folks know about who you are. I have 10 years experience doing sexual assault prevention work. All of the work I've done has been with communities that are considered marginalized or vulnerable or at risk. I'm putting that in air quotes, but you can't see it. And I really try to be intentional with how I do the work, knowing those areas of privilege that I have. I also have a background in HIV prevention, queer youth empowerment, curriculum development, and sexual health education. And if you look on this slide, you can see some of the things that we do at NSVRC. We run the U.S. Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is happening right now. We also have the largest library of sexual assault-related materials. If you ever need an article, we have access to lots of articles, and we are happy to send them to you. So that is just my little shout out. You can also find us on all of the social medias. You can check out our website. We also have e-learning. And in the interest of being quick, I am done. Pass it over to Maya.
Thank you, Mo. If you will go to the next slide. So as mentioned, I'm with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, and here is our mission. We're the Texas Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers, Advocate Survivors, and Allied Organizations. And next slide, please. And I am the evaluation manager at the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. It's actually a fairly new position. Our agency is located in Austin, Texas, and that's the ancestral lands of the Comanche and the Tonkawa. I actually have 3 different components to my job. So one is internal evaluation of TASA. Another is to build capacity in the field around evaluating the work of sexual violence programs. And the other part is gathering evidence on what works in the field of sexual violence. So one of those initiatives is working with small Texas campuses that have been designated Hispanic serving institutions and looking at community-based strategies for healing and prevention.
Muted.
And you'll have noticed some maps on there. So as an evaluator, I recognize strongly how one's life influences one's work, and I've led a fairly transnational life. So I was born in the Philippines to a Filipino mother and a U.S. citizen father, and I spent basically the first half of my childhood in the Philippines and the second half in Austin, Texas. I've spent around 20 years working in related fields like gender-based violence, preventative health, forced migration, resettlement, youth development, and the last 5 years focusing more and more on evaluating what works in those fields. And I've studied and researched and worked here in the U.S. as well as in Thailand, Malaysia, Japan, Spain, Haiti, and Colombia. I identify as cisgender, heterosexual, woman of color. My pronouns are she and her. And we can go on. Next slide, please.
Okay, so you are here because you're interested in expanding your prevention efforts into communities that are considered underserved or marginalized. And I also want to acknowledge that many of you are already doing the work. And even if you're not explicitly working in marginalized communities, that you're almost certainly working with people who have different identities than you. So I hope the information going forward will be useful. We'll talk on the next slide a little bit about what more to expect. these are the outcomes that we wrote for this webinar. But there's just some internal work to do in thinking about moving into working with folks from different communities. We're going to be talking today about why it's important to be thoughtful and to do internal work before moving into working with different communities, things to consider about the ways that your agency works, and things to consider and think about regarding your programs and your funding requirements. We're also going to spend some time talking about ways you can create space and set up your work in ways that can be trauma-informed and meet people's needs, and then also some ways you can think about and conduct needs and strengths assessments. And throughout, we're going to be sharing some stories from our work and the work that some of our colleagues have done. And like we were told in the beginning, we're going to have some time at the end, hopefully, to take some questions, and we'll have resources and links to share with you as well. And next slide, please.
So I think the first thing going into it and creating change is that there's a humility involved, that we as people who work at an agency, be it a rape crisis center or a dual agency or some other allied agency, we are not the answer. We are just part of the equation. So there should be relief as well, because it's not all on you and it can't be all on you. Much of the history of the anti-sexual violence movement is rooted in people from marginalized communities, particularly Black women, who were targeted and stood up against it. And if you're not familiar with the history of our movement, we've got some short reads that we'll share with you at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. A lot of times when we talk about working with communities, people see that as a way of telling them about us. Next slide, please. And the shift we'll really be kind of highlighting today is how meaningful work with communities really requires less bullhorns, less brochures even, and more ears. And why is this important? Because each and every one of us has grown up and been socialized particular stories about particular communities, and there's no avoiding these stories. They're in our news, they're in our TV shows, they're in our movies, they're in our commercials. And for some of these communities, there's only one story that's told about them, and that's usually of hardships, of challenges, of deficit, and it's often accompanied with a fair amount of blame for their own circumstances. Next slide, please. So when working with communities, something that we need to do first is examine ourselves and what stories we've been told and what kind of credence we give to those stories. And a term that has come up as a way to do this is to investigate our own implicit bias. A lot of you out there are probably familiar with the phrase, but for those who aren't, implicit bias simply means that what your perceptions that you have about people, you don't even think about, you don't even consciously think about, but they color your lens. It can cement you to a particular viewpoint without you even realizing it. Next slide, please. So there's a way that you can explore this yourself, and this is how I explored it myself. So there's a website that we will also share with you at the end of the webinar. And it's where you can go and take a test, and it'll actually tell you how you fare on implicit bias. And they'll give you your individual results, but they'll also share the aggregate results of everybody who's taken the test. So I took one on race and weapons about a year ago, and these are the aggregated results that they shared with me. So as you can see there, 71% have an association, an implicit bias that associates Black persons with weapons and whites with harmless objects. 71%. And that doesn't just happen in the vacuum of people's computer. We see how this plays out since Trayvon, since even in the last 30 days, we have Stephen Clark and Saheed Vessel who've been shot dead. Stephon Clark multiple times holding a cell phone in his grandmother's backyard, and Saheed Vessel shot in Brooklyn when police mistook a pipe for a gun while he was in the midst of a mental health crisis. And it's a police issue because it's a societal issue. It's a symptom of a systemic problem. Next slide, please. And these are kind of break down the results a little bit more. So you can see that the associations go from slight, moderate to strong. But this is more than half, right? 71%. So why am I bringing this up? as service providers, we may not hold guns, but we determine access. And this is one facet of a larger issue that plagues us as individuals who make up an organization that determine policies and how we provide services to survivors. And it plagues us when we reach out to communities who you might have only heard certain stories about and thus have an unconscious but ever-present association with those communities. So this isn't easy. And thinking about which communities with whom you're hoping to work, if you don't identify as a person of those communities, and some of you might, I don't want to take that away from you. I hope everyone's doing the time, taking the time to do some self-examination of how are stories that are implicitly or explicitly spreading anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, poor bashing, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, all of those things that we know that our society grapples with, how that might be affecting you personally as you do your work. Actively unlearning and checking my biases is something that I have to constantly practice and do, and I have to actively search out new and different voices, new and different stories for any that I'm lacking. Next page, please.
Okay, so before you start, so we've talked about like examining your own internal implicit biases and thinking about that. You also really want to take some time to think about your agency's history and your capacity to take on the work within your agency. So next slide. And here are some things to think about. So you'll want to think about what's the history. Does your workplace have any history with the community that you want to work with? And is it good history or bad history? That's important stuff to know because it can help shape your efforts. It's also really helpful to know what efforts have already taken place. So if someone in the past has embarked on similar work before or has been maybe part of a task force with the community or the organization that you want to partner with, this is really important because sometimes this information, well, I'd say a lot of times this information is lost when people move in and out of jobs. So if you're newer to your job or even if you haven't been there as long as your coworkers, it can be really helpful to ask them about that. This is also something to think about as you're doing your work too, so that you can kind of work on documenting the process and create that sort of historical agency knowledge that we sometimes lack. You also want to think about what kinds of relationships exist already. So maybe your executive director is friends with the executive director from the community program that you want to work with. This is really good to know about if the relationships are good, but it's also nice to know if there are any disagreements or not great relationships. You might also think about how you are supporting or promoting or showing up for other people's work too. Part of working with people in community is really supporting what they're doing. So do you promote community events already? Do you table at Pride? Do you sign letters of support? These are some visible ways of showing other folks that you're ready to take on this work and that it's not just, checking a box for you, that you want to work in this other community and move in there right away. You also want to think about duplicating, like, is it possible that you're inadvertently duplicating something that the community is already working on? I speak from personal experience here where I've been in a position where I was meeting with community partners, I was talking about working together on prevention stuff. I was new at my job and I had been hired to come in and work with LGBT youth, and I was hearing a lot that this kind of thing was already happening, and I just wasn't aware of it. It was a city that I had not worked in before, and I had really not done my part in terms of finding out what efforts were already happening in the community, and it was really embarrassing. So you might also think about how your prevention work could fit into a larger effort that's already happening or to another community's program. If there's already something going on, that could be an option. And lastly, I think it's important to think too about ownership. That gets into the idea of who is really in charge of what's going on. Sometimes we want to own it, and sometimes our funding requires memorandums of understanding, that sort of thing. But if we think about working with communities who are often used and tokenized and have information about them taken away and used against them, and we're thinking that we want to be partners in this work, it's also really worth thinking about how you can structure your partnerships and how that can benefit the folks that you want to work with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Okay, next slide. So you can also look internally about not just the relationships that your agency has, but also what's the readiness? What's the readiness in the agency that you're working with now? So you want to think about the agency's capacity to support the people that you want to work with. So not just within your own program or department. I don't know if a lot of you are prevention staff at your agency, but I have pretty much always been either the only or like one of two prevention people in the place that I'm working at. And I've been doing prevention work with, like I had said, youth who are really marginalized and not always, having the resources available to them. And I've had to think about, do I feel comfortable referring the folks that I'm working with in prevention to the larger agency? Like, do I think that they would get good advocacy? Do I think they would get good therapy services? And it's hard to say that the answer has not always been yes. And so that's a really important thing to think about in terms of your agency's commitment. If you want to work with trans youth and do prevention, you really want to think about things like, what's your agency's commitment to trans inclusion? Is it anywhere in your written materials? Have folks been trained about it? And also thinking about if your agency's committed to continuing this community-specific work even after the specific funding is over. A lot of times I know we will get work based on grants or what money is available. But you don't want to just go in and go out of a community because you have money one year and you don't the next year. So thinking about that kind of long-term relationship is important too. Also thinking about maybe your agency is not where you want to be. So this is kind of a consideration. Like, this happened at a place that I was working with. I realized, like, I don't really want to refer people to where I'm working, and that felt bad. We ended up becoming part of a project where we did a really robust internal assessment of the whole agency to find out if our agency was accessible for LGBTQ folks. And that was really interesting and it was really useful. So there's checklists that you can use to determine some steps you can take to improve access, and we can send you more information about that too. But if you want to move into a different community than where you've been working, your whole career, or somewhere that you haven't worked before, you do want to take a look at what that capacity is. You also really want to think, too, about if people are ready or even interested in working with you. So before you start the work or even do like a community needs assessment, you want to think again about those relationships. So is there anybody that you know? Is there anybody who's friends with someone and you could talk to and maybe build a relationship from that? Maybe you're on a committee together. You also want to think about other people's ability to do the work with you. I mean, you might have the funding and the structure and the staff time and everything to do a prevention program, but you also want to think about what the other folks need to do that work as well. So if there's a way that you can support them in building up that staff capacity, the time, the scheduling, things you need for reporting, all of that stuff. So all of those things really take time. They require you to do some thinking, talking to others, and kind of really getting clear about where you're at before you try to move into working in a different community. Sometimes, too, you just might not be the best person to take this on, and I think that's a thing that we have to think about as well. Sometimes things that are by and for a community are the best options for them, and we can think about ways we can support that, and if there's a way to support that in our work. So next slide. Yes, so follow through is really important. Do you see our emojis? We added in this grimacing, like, you gotta do it. Sometimes we know that projects don't pan out the way you're hoping, and, that happens. Sometimes you're going forward trying to find some funding and you don't get it. But, Maya and I were both talking about one sure way to lose trust with people and to really harm a relationship is to not follow through with what you say you're going to do. So this means that you're really going to want to practice being transparent about what you can offer, what the project is about, what the timeline is, and then really being good about following up if and when things change, because they inevitably will. Next slide.
So because we're working in the anti-violence, gender-based violence field, I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind some feminist principles around what knowledge is like. And Sager and Brissolara have articulated these 6 tenets of what feminist research and evaluation look like. And I think 3 of them are really relevant to this webinar because they're around like how we create knowledge together. So in working with communities, you know, our mainstream business and academic norms, they tend to strive for us to take credit for things, right? So they value attribution instead of contribution. But if we're working towards change, we're working with different types of knowledge. So as agencies working towards ending violence, we've got to be sure that that doesn't mean inflicting knowledge theft on our communities, right? So if they're helping to produce knowledge around what change should look like, of course they should be able to share in that knowledge and to also be credited for that knowledge. Next slide, please. This is an important one. Knowledge and values are culturally, socially, and temporally contingent. I'll admit that most of my my work with youth was done in the early 2000s. I wouldn't dream of going into those same communities now with the same strategies that I had back then. The world is so completely different. We didn't have Instagram, for one thing. So if you know one child, you know one child. If you know one community, you know one community. And we're using the term community really loosely right now, but it's really important that you have a very clear idea of what you mean by community, because that word gets thrown around, and communities aren't monoliths, right? So immigrant communities might share a lot, but each community is unique and dynamic and evolving and adapting to the world around them. So just because you've worked with one neighborhood, working with a neighborhood of a similar makeup won't always be the same. Yeah, I think that's good. And next slide, please. So there's this, some of y'all might be familiar with it, but there's a parable, a story, a fable about a group of people, and I'm going to change it up a little bit. So a group of people are blindfolded and led into a room and told to figure out what was also in the room. So one person grabs a tail and announces that it's a rope. The other holds a leg and decides that it's a tree. Another's touching a trunk and they announce that it's a hose. And then another person feels the ear and decides that this is a fan. So only by listening to each other and believing each other could they possibly arrive at the conclusion that this is an elephant. So there are multiple ways of knowing, and some ways are privileged over others. And this is where I'm going to get a little soapboxy, sorry. But much of our knowledge traditions and how we share knowledge come from knowledge traditions imposed by European colonialism. So we have this white anthropologist who are studying the air quotes savages or the air quotes natives. And you can still recognize phrases in use today that demean or that marginalize certain knowledges. The boonies, that comes from the Filipino word boondock, which means a mountain, but it's come to mean an empty place in the middle of nowhere. We have phrases like gone native, voodoo, black magic, joking about underwater basket weaving as a thing to learn. And we've been taught not to value knowledge that didn't come about via the European Age of Enlightenment kind of scientific method. So, and we hear it with like old housewives, right? Or a housewives' tale. And we could go on and on. The list is lengthier than it should be. All of this to say that it's really important to consider different ways of knowing and to be cognizant not to marginalize knowledge, particularly of those who come from oral traditions who don't have those histories written down in particular ways. Underinvested, over-criminalized, and marginalized communities have come up with really creative means of survival that are often stigmatized and often looked down upon. So if they're telling you it's a rope, and from your vantage point, you've always been told it's a tree and it looks like a tree, are you going to be able to believe that it's a rope? Next slide, please.
So when we're thinking about doing this work and understanding that there's so many ways of having knowledge and valuing knowledge, it's also really good to think about the ways that we have power in our work. For I would guess probably all of you and all of us, we're getting paid to do this. This is our job and our career. So it's important to think about, what are others going to be getting from this? Is it an equal partnership? One of the things that I've really strived to do in my work, and I would encourage you all to do as well, is thinking about what you can do to make this feel worth it to other folks. If you can do any sorts of payment, stipends, volunteer credit or appreciation. You also want to think about not tokenizing the people that you're working with. So I just have a really quick story about how I was working with a group of youth, and we were working on digital safety. So cyberspace, and we made it really cool and prevention-y. And I would bring these youth to meetings because I was like, well, these are the folks I'm working with. And we had some folks who were helping with some fundraising, and they were like, these youth are amazing. They're so wonderful. We want them to come and talk to all of these people, and we really want to share their knowledge. But some of them were doing it in kind of a weird, creepy, tokenizing way. And so I ended up needing to be this buffer in between, not wanting the folks that I'm working with to get tokenized or used as these cool, urban youth. I'm doing so many air quotes. I really should be putting myself on the webcam, but, using all of these terms for the folks that I'm working with, they're just special, weird things other than just people that I'm working with. And so we were able to figure out some ways where the youth could really be involved, but in ways that they felt good about, that they didn't feel like they were being taken advantage of, and that worked on their terms, and they were able to get paid for that. And so, there are some ways to think about, it's powerful to have folks be really active and visible participants, but you also don't want to tokenize people. Also thinking about this knowledge and thinking about the information that we are required to get for our funding, and collecting data and sharing back reports and stuff. It's important to think about how you're sharing that kind of evaluation and information back with the community. And Maya talked about this too, about the community needs to have ownership over the things that we're doing. A lot of folks who are considered marginalized and vulnerable are asked to take tests. There's lots of times there's data gathered and used about them. People are being examined from the outside. This is something that's happened historically, and, there's so many examples that we could talk about where folks who are considered marginalized, folks who are people of color, who are poor, who are immigrants, are having medical experiments done on them in terms, in the basis of science. And so it's really important, if we want to be cool, not gross, tokenizing, awful people, we don't want to reinforce that, and we don't want to have that happen again. So thinking about how we can really share information about the things that we're doing. Let's go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about how we can do this. So sometimes in our work, this is a thing I've noticed that can be a helpful way of thinking about doing this work and working with folks from different communities, is that you're kind of like a translator. You're the one who really needs to make the connections between the work that you're doing and the project outcomes and the reportings. So we've been talking a lot, or I actually think I have been more than Maya, saying the words marginalized or at risk, because I know that a lot of us want to do work with people who have a lot of need, and that's totally cool. But when you're working with communities, you really want to use the language that they're using. I've worked with so many young people, and I've never met any of them who would call themselves marginalized or at risk. It's just not, I don't know anybody who talks about themselves that way. But we can translate the information that comes from our grant reports or our funding to the folks that we're working with, and we can work with the young people or the folks in different communities and translate that information back into our funding reports. I think, to really be clear, I guess I'm just saying, we don't necessarily want to go in and work with people and say, oh yeah, you're definitely at risk and you're marginalized. It also doesn't recognize the strengths of communities, and which we'll be talking about in a little bit too. One of the ways that I have seen this happen, this is just a short story from my past prevention work. One of the root causes of violence that a young person I was working with saw, it was actually a bunch of young people. I was working with youth who are homeless or street involved. And a lot of them were saying, you know, we just don't have any power. We just don't have any power in the world, in life. They didn't want to talk about sexual violence as much as they wanted to talk about power. And I was like, yes, I totally hear you. I was able to see what they were talking about because I had hung out with them enough to be like, yeah, people really are not cool with you. And it was my job to translate that into how does that relate to sexual violence? A lack of power is a root cause of violence. And it was my job to not say, well, we really need to focus on sexual assault. One of the things that I did to do this was having the youth take on roles within the prevention group, like jobs. So they ended up getting volunteer credit and payment for the things that they were doing. And we still did stuff that was related to sexual assault. But one of the things that it really helped was it helped them be able to get jobs, which helped them get power. And this was something that we were able to talk about together and get to together because we were really talking about, like, why does violence happen? What are the reasons why you see this happening? And I never would have guessed. I mean, not that I wouldn't have guessed that it's about a lack of power, but I was kind of thinking it was about some other things. And they were like, no, Mo, the most important thing is that we get jobs and that we make money so we don't have to be homeless, and that will help us so much. So I ended up being the translator to making that work for the program I was doing. I hope that makes sense. Let's go to the next slide really quick. There's also power in using transparency. So I was just talking about how, like, we don't necessarily want to go into places and go, oh, yes, you are marginalized young people. But I've also found that it can be really powerful to share the requirements of the project and some of that grant language and funding language. That can be a great way of talking about, like, well, what does this phrase mean to you? Or what are the words that you use instead? This can also be a great way to gather information about community needs and priorities, and then it can help you create shared language together. When you're humble enough to be like, well, this is what my job thing says, but I know that might not work for you, and it's not really how I talk about people, but it's kind of how the government talks about people. How can we talk about this instead? That can be really powerful. You can also report back on that. I think sometimes it's good to tell back the powers that be, like, hey, these are the words that we're using for this, and this is how these folks are talking about the things that we're doing together. I think also being willing to, like, share the internal process of how the work is going can really pull that curtain back on the parts of our jobs that are sometimes kind of mysterious. And I've had really great success in working with young folks who they wanted to do this work as well. They were like, this is really important to me. I want to gain skills so that I can do my own prevention work too. And being able to be transparent and share some of that information with them has built their prevention skills. So they've gone on to now be preventionists as well. So I think thinking about transparency and how you can share that power can be really useful too. Next slide.
Thank you, Mo. I think all of that is really super important, especially in how we're, like, doing the day-to-day work. This is really just kind of, I hate to call them logistical considerations, but they're kind of logistical considerations. Whenever working in the community, you know, even if you're doing prevention, we know that it's a good idea to expect trauma in the room, whether it be acute trauma or complex trauma. We know the statistics, we know the odds. But when you're working with communities who have been under-resourced, economically excluded, over-criminalized, expect multiple layers of trauma. And that includes historical and intergenerational trauma because they've been targets for generations. In my experience, there has been no meaningful community engagement or collaboration that doesn't account for hunger in children. In my local community work, we are absolutely sure to bring some sort of food and plan children's activities or designate somebody to be in charge of the kids, because we know that people can't show up to these things if they're not accounted for. If you want families in the room, you got to plan for kids. And that might mean having to get creative because we all work with funding restrictions, especially if you're federally funded. So you might have to think about, is bringing food something volunteers can do? Do you have non-restricted funds to support evening activities? But the bottom line is, if you want families to attend, then you have to make it easy for them to attend. The other question is who you're inviting and who are you prepared to accommodate? Do you have interpreters available? Are materials just blocks and blocks and blocks of text? And it'll be basically meaningless if you have limited English proficiency or if you have low literacy levels in the room. And we will share these with you at the end, but API GBV and National Latino Network have great tools around language access for your agency. And just like Mo was saying, it's really important to validate what their most pressing concerns are. And sexual violence, you know, as pressing as it is, may not be the overall community's most pressing concerns. One of our prevention workers was working in a kind of satellite community and found out that the community didn't have access to water. Well, it's really hard to do prevention programming when people don't have access to water. And so, you know, basic needs, that's a risk factor. So she joined in community efforts to make sure that they got their water back, because she couldn't do her work until that happened. So just like Mo said, acknowledging that sexual violence prevention might look different than how it's commonly written about. And next slide, please. Luckily, we already have a really valuable tool that we have within our field to kind of think about all these things. So we have these trauma-informed principles, meaning that we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. And I think if you look at these, they're pretty familiar. They really overlap with what we've been talking about. And if they're principles that we can use on an individual level, on the micro level, then it's something to think about. How do these principles resonate on an agency-wide level or on a macro level through our policies and through our practices as we reach out and build relationships and collaborate with communities? And I believe I got these from SAMHSA. You can get that from their trauma interventions on their website. Next slide, please.
This is great. I feel like we're kind of talking in these like spirals, like we say something and then one of us or the other one of us like re-emphasizes it, like we kind of are going around and around, and there's so much to think about. And we're not like, oh yeah, don't do this because you have to think about all these things first. But I think this laying the groundwork stuff and really thinking about these things before you just get out there and start working with folks is so important to think about. And it doesn't have to be hard or exhausting or tedious either. It can be really fun. So one of the things that we'll move into talking about are community needs and strengths assessments. This is something that you can do in your work. A lot of you are probably doing it already, or have done it already, but there's formal ways and more informal ways to do it, and they all kind of are great. And I'll just be really transparent. When I was working with Maya to put this together, I only had it saying community needs assessments. I always talk about needs assessments. I'm like, needs. And then Maya was like, yeah, but also strengths, right? And she had talked about that before too. Part of doing these assessments is recognizing the needs that folks have, but also the strengths that they're bringing too. When you're doing these needs and strengths assessments, it can really help you and the community figure out like, what really is needed? What are the priorities? Is it a job? Is it water? Is it like this one hallway is a weird hallway to walk down and we don't really know why? Thinking about what resources folks have already, what challenges they face. Needs assessments can also give you data, which is really helpful in creating your work and evaluating it too.
And just to add on that, I think one of the reasons I'm always like, and strengths too is really important, is that, you know, just in the way that Mo described, that people don't describe themselves as marginalized. You know, communities that have been, and you're going to get tired of hearing me say this word, but under-resourced, economically excluded, and over-criminalized. They're well aware of their needs. They live their needs. They're used to being defined by their needs from those who are outside of their community. And so needs will naturally be part of the conversation. You're not going to have to do any extra work to get needs into there. But just as, we use tools like motivational interviewing and strengths-based assessments, that needs to be done community-wide too, right? So that we can honor and recognize and support community strengths. And remember that, as we mentioned in the beginning, our movement, as we know it, is rooted in the mental, emotional, and physical strength of Black communities, standing up to the repression and the violence enacted against them in the most difficult of circumstances, and so they were able to find that kind of strength to lift all of us up, and through that. Next slide, please. So there is a wealth of tools that go on about doing just that, looking at the strengths of communities, and they have no shortage of different facilitation activities that you can use. So one of these places is the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. It used to be in Northwestern, but it has since moved to DePaul University. We will share a website with you. You're also going to get sick of me saying that, but we will. And on that website, you can find PowerPoints. You can find no lack of, like I said, facilitation activities on how do you center strengths in the conversations that you're having with people. Next slide, please.
Okay, so here is a toolbox. This is one of the resources that we also wanted to share with you. The Indiana Coalition Against DV created this assessment toolbox that, accounts for needs, but I think can also account for strengths as well. We'll share that link as well as a resource. This is just kind of a little snapshot of what the website looks like. There's a section that walks you through what this community needs and strengths assessment is. It also has a collection of different methods you can use. And then it also has these community spotlights you can see with the yellow circle. You can see examples of what other people have done with these tools, which can be really helpful in, I don't know if you're an example kind of person, but I definitely am. Next slide, please. And this is also another kind of snapshot of what the website looks like. So these are some more methods that are included in the toolbox. We're not going to get into detail about all of them. I do have a story about one method, but you can choose different methods based on what sounds good to the folks you're working with, what you want to learn, what they want to learn. We would also encourage you to try things that are maybe different than what you've done before. I know a lot of times we use focus groups or maybe key informant interviews to shape our prevention work, but if you've done that, you might think of something like secondary data. Maya and I are both like, yes, secondary data. We both like it a lot. The nice thing about it is that it's basically data that already exists. So if your state is doing student surveys about risky behavior or sexual health or something like that, if you can access that sort of data, that can also help you kind of get an idea about what the situation is in the community that you want to work with as well. It can help you not duplicate things. It's something that other people have already used their time and resources to do, and so it can be an interesting thing to do. So yeah, you can check that out more. We'll send you the link to this toolkit. Next slide, please.
And because my job is evaluation manager, and I notice that when I say the word evaluation, sometimes people's eyes tend to glaze over or they start backing out of the room away from me. I just want to make sure to emphasize the difference between big E evaluation and little e evaluation. With little e evaluation and kind of, researchy activities, something that we all do, if we're interested in learning about the people that we work with. And because I was a facilitator first and an evaluator much later, part of the reason I liked it so much was because I was like, oh, I already do these things. They just have really fancy terms that I didn't realize. So what I would encourage you all to do is just to be kind of systematically informal about how you're kind of gathering knowledge and sharing that knowledge. So participatory observation is really when we kind of watch and learn and observe. Informal interviewing is just getting to know somebody, right? Like, what's important to you? What are you about? And coffee talk. Very few people will be like, yes, I want a focus group with you. But if you're like, hey, let's have some tea and talk about what you're thinking, that can be a whole lot more relatable. So just like Mo had mentioned earlier, we can translate our methods into things that are a little bit more natural and relatable to the different communities that we work in. Next slide, please. So, as I'd mentioned, in terms of when you're creating the space, one of the things that can be really difficult, especially if you've heavily relied on printed materials in the past, is words, if there's language issues and if there's literacy issues there as well. So one of the things that I love to use, because I've worked in both of those populations, is using image-based facilitation. So Mo will talk a little bit more about photo voice, and photo facilitation deck or cards can be kind of like a mini photo voice. But rich pictures is something, it's called a soft method. But it's something that, you can basically ask a participant to draw out something like a complex idea or process. And one question I pose is like, what does being feminine mean to you, right? And asking people to draw out what femininity means to them. And you can do the same thing with masculinity. And so it gets people out of having to worry about, is this the right word? And really just kind of enabling them to get to those concepts in a different way. It's going to be messy. People are going to be tentative at first, but at the end of it, the picture is not important at all. What's important is how they interpret what they've drawn and how they share that. And sometimes that mental model can be a little bit hard to come to and articulate right off the bat, but when you're kind of given a blank space and told to fill it with scribbles and doodles, then something comes out of it. Next slide, please.
Okay, so here is an example, and we actually have a video podcast that just came out of the person I'm talking about who led this group. Let me tell you about the example, and I'll make sure that we send you the link to the video too, so you can learn more about photo voice. But photo voice is basically you give the folks that you're working with cameras or like cell phones, or a lot of people do this still with cameras and get the film developed. But give people cameras and ask them, what do you see in your community? What are the great things about your community? What do you like to do? What are the things that aren't so good? There's lots of different ways to conduct this. But in Indiana, someone named Sierra worked with young people who have disabilities, and she used photo voice as a way of figuring out with these folks, like, what do you want to work on? What are the needs that you have? What should we do in our work? She was really surprised. I think this is the thing that always happens to me. I always go into a new group of folks and I think, okay, I think I know. I think I know what's going to happen here. I think I know what you're going to say, because I feel like I'm smart and I know prevention and I know, like, I try to do a good job of knowing who I'm working with, but I always am surprised. And so Sierra was really surprised too, because the folks who she was working with are all people who, because of the way that they are disabled, they have folks who are carers who go with them, and a lot of them use walkers or wheelchairs. And the thing that came back in the photos were all of these pictures of physical limitations that people had, of like sidewalks and bus stops and gravel and rain. And so what she found and what people were expressing back is that people weren't actually able to get to some of the really cool things that existed in their community because they couldn't access even the bus stop to get somewhere because this one part of the street had gravel on it and they weren't able to maneuver their chair over it. Or a place had a lot of potholes, and when it rained, people would like get soaking wet and stuff, or there were really busy streets and people didn't have a safe way of crossing the street. They ended up doing this whole mapping project where they have this GIS map. One of the youth participants is like, oh, I can make a map with this. And they ended up doing all of this stuff to work with the city to improve the infrastructure. So things like paving these portions of sidewalks and installing crosswalks. It took off in a way different direction than what she was thinking about. But she was able to translate this as relating to prevention because we know that some of the things that make folks with disabilities marginalized and vulnerable in these really certain ways have to do with their ability to like access services or even like get around or rely on other people. And so it was just really interesting. She never would have found this out unless she had done photo voice. And if you're interested in hearing more about this, I'd encourage you to look at the video. I'll send it out. She's really cool. The project is really cool. But yeah, that's just an example of how you can use something like this to find out, how you can work with a different community. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry.
Just to add to that, so what's another great thing about Photo Voice is that you come up with all of these great pictures that could be of varying quality. So people have done art galleries with the pictures that their young people have taken. And the center in El Paso, I know, did a project with survivors, and they had those pictures blown up and posted all throughout the agency. So there's kind of like this permanent record of the Photo Voice project that they did. It's pretty cool.
That's so cool. This is another resource that you can check out. I think this is super interesting. It's an NSVRC publication, but it's a case study of stuff that folks did. It's called Walking in Balance with All Our Creations. It's a curriculum. The study goes into detail about like how the curriculum was created, how these folks incorporated the cultural values and historical context into the curriculum, and then how they worked with the evaluators. The thing that is really interesting in this is that there's a lot of information about lessons learned. The evaluators go into detail about like the kind of preconceptions they had going in and what they learned and what they're changing in their work as a result of doing this. There's recommendations for other folks who want to do culturally specific work. And I think just overall it does a good job of highlighting the importance of really involving community members and the community members' cultural norms and values into the project planning and the evaluation planning and implementation. So we'll make sure that you see that as well.
These are kind of some of the resources that we had already mentioned. And somewhere in there is Community at the Center, which is a really fantastic YouTube video around the field of community engagement. So I highly suggest that you take a look at that one. That looks at 6 different agencies and how they've kind of centered their communities in their work. And we will send those links out to you if you can't click on them from this webinar, which you probably can't. But I guess now would be a great time for questions if there are any.
I'm not seeing any questions yet.
Wow, I kind of was thinking that there would be so many questions. That's interesting. I'm just talking now because you were like, definitely keep talking. But I know that it was really, I don't know, this is a thing that I think people are talking about all the time is like, how do we work with people who have like a high level of need or people who are not part of my own personal community? And I love that we're thinking about this more and that we're kind of exploring more like, how can we do this work in an awesome way and not hurt people and not, inadvertently be a bad community partner. So hopefully there's some things to think about here. And And I hope the stories were useful too. I'm definitely interested if people have questions about communities that you're working with, or challenges that you have, or if there's anything that you want to know about doing any sort of like agency assessments and stuff. Those are just some ideas for possible things you could ask us.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, and I was just gonna say, because I always like think back to what I said. I'm like, did I sound when I was talking about different parts of or different types of knowledge, I hope people didn't think or didn't understand me to be downing on the scientific method, which I think is a total valuable tool. Just the idea that that's the only means that we can come to knowledge. What were you going to say, Josh?
So I was just curious if you all have anything to discuss just around the idea of incorporating, a intentional anti-oppression framework into this sort of community work. I know at the heart, essentially, it is taking on that anti-oppression framework, but just curious if you all have anything to elaborate on that aspect of the conversation.
I think that's a really great question. And I think an important thing to do is to, because another thing to consider, I think number one, I mean, I work from an anti-oppression framework, but the more we know, the more we can tend to assume that everybody should and does know. And part of that oppression is erasing people's histories or separating them from their histories. And so when we go into communities, it's important not to assume that everybody has the same understanding of what their history is. Here in Texas, whether you speak Spanish or not has so much to do with whether you were allowed to in school, whether your parents were punished for speaking Spanish in public, whether they were punished and not given jobs because they had an accent. And so because, throughout the U.S. we have these different stories around different communities, and because those stories hurt, they may not be passed down from generation to generation. So I would say that it's good to have it always in your mind, always in the forefront, but not impose those onto the communities that you're going into.
Wonderful. We did just have a question come through, and it says, how do you encourage people to come to focus groups, actually get them to show up?
That is a wonderful question. I think, number one, you got to talk about something they're interested in.
Yeah.
And number two, food. I mean, I can't say this enough. It's one of the things that I just always say. But it's really hard to do things without food. Because people are hungry and we're busy, and to have to decide between dinner and a focus group, I mean, dinner's going to win for me every single time. And to plan for, if you're wanting, I think it depends on who you want the focus group to be with, right? So that focus group, the messaging around that focus group, what you're going to talk about, all of that needs to be super tailored to the people that you are talking to, and involve culturally relevant kind of activities. Like there was one focus group that included loteria into it. Just make it fun, think about ways that you can make this not just an information gathering session, but a community building session, and how does knowledge and information get shared in that community building?
Yeah, you might want to think about who is the champion for this work that you have connection with in the community already. And they can help you generate excitement. And a lot of times, folks who are in the community are going to be like, yeah, this is how you do things here. And if you want to do it, you have to come at like 6:00 at night while we're having the dinner, and you have to talk for this amount of time. So if there's a way for you to build in flexibility about when you can hold a focus group, how you can structure it, then that can be really important too. And I think sometimes if you're able to pay people, that's really nice as well. Food is super important, childcare, all of that stuff. But having having your champion in the community who's helping you put it on and shape it up, and maybe paying people. Yeah, those are some ideas.
Yeah, I can't agree more about that champion. Some communities are so burnt on different agencies coming in and promising things that unless you have somebody who kind of introduces you to the community that they trust, or a gatekeeper, you're probably not going to have a lot of luck. They're just going to think same old, same old.
That happened to me when I was working with youth who are homeless or street involved. There's this drop-in center in Seattle, and it's downtown, and it's like the go-to place. So, people are always there. Like, the news is there doing stuff. There's people there because they're like an intern or a graduate student and they want to conduct a survey or something. And so I found folks being really, really skeptical of me, and I had to hang out there for months and months and months, like a year of like regular hanging out, sitting around, painting nails, bringing snacks, talking, doing different fun activities, and like chatting with the staff and becoming friends-ish with the staff before people were like, oh, okay, you're cool, we can work with you. Because they just got so used to people being like, yeah, this is like the homeless drop-in center. And so they wanted to go there because it's a great place to be, and that's where they get a lot of resources and food and clothes and all sorts of stuff. But then they always had to deal with people wanting to like take things from them and use their information and like get their information and not really give anything back.
And that's a really important point. Focus group for what? They have to know what the point of you asking them to come together is, and they need to know what they're going to get out of it. So that, it's not like extractative is something that we use a lot, that you're not just taking information out and not giving it back, which goes back to that, knowledge should be shared for those who create it.
I love that story, and in a lot of ways, again, it goes back to what you were discussing around what is knowledge and the different ways that we retain and understand knowledge, very much that scientific basis in terms of, I just want to come in and do a focus group and gather data from you all, but then doing the prep work and that relationship building and getting to understand and getting that community and those individuals to trust you before you even start diving into that kind of research aspect of it. Love that. So we are out of time. Is there anything else that you all would like to share before we wrap up?
I would like to thank everybody. I got the message from Josh that people were sending thoughts and prayers because my husband had a pretty serious bike accident, so he's at home convalescing on the slow road to recovery. But thank you so much for thinking of us.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you, too, for all of the great information that you passed along to us today. And thanks again to everybody who attended our webinar. And be looking for that follow-up email with all of the resources and a copy of the PDF version of the slides from today, and then a link to our YouTube channel where you can pass along this wonderful webinar to your friends and coworkers. And just want to mention CCAS's next webinar coming up in May on the 24th. Will, the clinical director for the Salva Center, will be presenting on the topic of support group for sexual assault survivors. We will be sending out an announcement for that with the registration link in it starting next week. But I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you.